So what is the difference between alpha, beta, early access, Steam early access? It feels like so many games aren't being released in a finished state nowadays. Like why? What is that?
Yeah, it's a thing that has many names, right?
Yeah.
And I think one of the things many people don't necessarily realize is alpha and beta isn't like a pre-prescribed like dictionary term. You know, it has many meanings to different people. I think what we're seeing right now, there's a lot of discomfort and distrust even around early access in particular, and these pre-release periods, betas, alphas, closed, whatever. It's a growing pains period. I mean, the industry is changing, especially on PC. I do think it'll eventually come to console in a different form. And naturally, people are sort of feeling out what it means. Developers are figuring out what it means. You know, how can we sort of bend the rules? How can we use it to our purposes? Because especially with early access, what's kind of unfortunate about it is a one-size-fits-all term. It's being applied to all these different games, but it's being used in very different ways. So the expectations around what early access means, that's sort of developing in positive and negative ways, but it's not always consistent.
You know, there's the classic case of Space Base, the Double Fine game, where the devs were essentially treating the early access period of that game as a way to fund the development of it from not shutting down, and then when not enough people were buying the early access part of the game, they couldn't continue making it, and then all those broken promises were kind of laying there, and a lot of people felt burned.
It was a hopeful project, I think, and I do think they, by their own admission, they kind of pulled the plug in a way that they didn't communicate in advance that this is coming, it's not really working out for us.
If you really want to go back to where did this really start to take off, Minecraft was the runaway early access success. And since it did succeed so well, and since Notch didn't just like take all the money he made from that and run, and he actually finished the development of the game, and he made a really good game out of it, people got a lot of faith in early access, and they got a lot of faith in that business model that then a lot of other people didn't follow through on as well. And it like you said, it created distrust for the entire system.
I mean, I do think there have been a few cases where it has been poorly used. I mean, you look back at what was like Earth 2066, which was a game that really inspired Valve and Steam to sort of distribute guidelines and rules for early access to avoid situations like that in the War Z, where the game was marketed as one thing and it was sold as kind of a very different thing. At the same time, I do think there's been some overreaction. I think people have to remember that they're not, I hesitate to use the word entitled, but they're not entitled to everything. They're not entitled to a game that just perpetually exists until the end of time and is filled with free updates and like just lives forever. You know, and as much as like I'm happy and it's our responsibility to call out the bad cases like Space Base, which were kind of poorly handled, if you're putting it politely. At the same time, I don't think early access necessarily deserves the bad rap that it seems like it's getting in a lot of our comment threads and a lot of places like on Reddit that I see. Well,
I mean, I agree that there are a lot of success stories with it, but also I totally understand why it gets that bad rap. When it's a really appealing project that you really want to be this great successful thing, like, oh man, this game would be so cool when it's done, and then it just never follows through and you've spent $20 on the early game and it never gets updated again, that's like awful. That's an awful, awful feeling.
There's always going to be that strong core community that wants to follow the story of development from beginning to end. I was like that with DayZ, where like part of the entertainment for me is giving my feedback, seeing how it's perceived, seeing what the developer reacts to, and seeing how the game changes over time.
If you're willing to pay money for what is hopefully clearly marked an unfinished product, then you will know what you're getting into, essentially. You'll know why you're there. You're there to, like you said, be that part of that community that's there from the very beginning all the way through its development cycle. And unfortunately, I think something like that didn't happen with a game like H1Z1, where it had this great marketing budget behind it with SOE, and they pitched it as this really cool, awesome game. And when it came out, it wasn't bad by any means. It was just an early access game, and people had these high expectations of it being sold, meaning that it was more finished than it actually was.
I mean, what sort of environment would you like to game in? Would you like to game in an environment where SOE perhaps doesn't even get to make H1Z1 at all because no publisher would help them publish it? Or they wait until 2016 to publish it independently and they spend all this money and resources and they release it and they haven't learned all the things like they're learning right now in early access, and they have to spend another 6 months or a year, or the game doesn't do well because it's not in as good of a shape as it would be through this long testing period. Now, I think what needs to happen in the meanwhile is Valve needs to be much more transparent and consistent about what guidelines and what sort of rules are in place and what protections are in place for people, because I do think it's pretty unclear, and they're sort of allowing early access as like a badge to develop like this stigma necessarily, that because there's no like set of hard guidelines behind them.
At what point does Valve start going through early access games and saying, okay, this hasn't been updated in 6 months, and they said they were going to do updates every month, we're taking it down? Do they do that at all? I think that would cause a lot of outrage, because then it comes down to their opinion.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, the way Valve operates, they want everything to be very automated. I think they've shown that with a lot of their systems, like Steam Workshop. They want to trust the system.
Yeah.
But without knowing what happens behind closed doors and in emails and stuff like that, I really hope that they're taking more ownership over that system, because it's their brand. It's part of Steam's reputation. Yeah. It's becoming a really fundamental part of how we interact with PC games, and I want to continue to interact with it. I want to trust early access. I want to have those good early experiences and early looks. It's really useful to us to get a chance to see stuff over time and how it changes, and cover stuff for longer rather than waiting up until launch.
But some early access successes, like Divinity Original Sin, is another game where I didn't even play Divinity Original Sin in early access. I wanted to play it in its final version, and even then, some amount of months after I started playing it and was 60 hours into the campaign, they did another big update, and they added more. And that game was a huge success. Kerbal Space Program was a huge success in early access. All of these come back to, they feel similar to me as Minecraft, where they had these nice, good content update schedules. People embraced them with a community that got around them, not just people buying into it. And it made them really flourish, and they're these really iconic games that are fantastic and probably wouldn't exist otherwise.
I do think it's important for us to remind ourselves of those positive early access or pre-release games. And I'm really a big fan of the way Darkening Dungeons handle themselves. I mean, they sort of released with a very complete nugget of the game that they're going to expand on and add additional characters to, but it was very playable from beginning to end. And the fact it was like a permadeath game, the fact it was kind of a roguelike, I think made a lot of sense, because it's very iterative in your gameplay experience. You're making like these single runs, and they were very focused on like tuning and balance and stuff like that, and playing with their systems, like the sanity system. So.
And Darkening Dungeons felt very complete when I played it as well. It was one of the few early access games that I played, and I kind of forgot it was early access.
It's an interesting time. I mean, I think my attitude about early access and pre-release stuff in general is people are still figuring it out. We're figuring it out, gamers are figuring it out, developers are figuring it out, publishers are figuring it out too, and using it in some interesting ways still. But I think we should, like, obviously, call out the bad uses of that system and really condemn that and be clear about that. Instances like Earth 2066 and Space Base and some of the survival games that are kind of clinging to early access. But I want to see more people kind of embrace the kind of bumps in the road as bumps in the road, because this is a new and exciting way of distributing games that kind of we get to be a part of. And obviously there are some downsides to it, but there are upsides to it too that I think are plentiful, in that developers get to sell their games directly to us. There's no publisher between us anymore in a lot of these cases. And that has really meaningful creative benefits in terms of the types of games we get to play.
So let us know in the comments what your guys' experience with early access is. Are you a fan of it? Have you been burned by it? Do you have any questions about us or our opinions on specific games? Just let us know in the comments, and we'll try to get back to you. Hey everybody, I'm back. I was just right there, but we're now in the Q&A portion of the PC Gamer Show, where we take your questions from all over the internet, on our Facebook, our Twitter, wherever you ask them about whatever's on your mind in PC gaming this week. Our first question comes from @MJ on Twitter, and he asks, is the performance increase worth upgrading to an SSD? And the answer is pretty much yes. Not for general media files. You don't need an SSD for, videos and music and that sort of thing. But if you want a smaller SSD that you could actually afford for just gaming and especially your OS, it's completely worth the performance upgrade. And our second question comes from @PlatGuardian, also on Twitter, who asks, should I get Windows 10 over Windows 7 64-bit? And the answer to this one is kind of different because they're basically the same thing now. The Windows 10 development build is available for free right now, but if you get Windows 7, you'll get a free upgrade to Windows 10 anyway. So either way you go, you're gonna end up with Windows 10 once it comes out. I think go for it. Try the development build. If it works for you, then, you know, get Windows 7 and you'll upgrade for free. That's all the questions we got time for today. Ask us anything that's on your mind in PC gaming with the hashtag AskPCGamer on our Twitter, our Facebook page, our YouTube page, on the comments of this video on PCGamer.com, and of course our Steam group. Thanks very much, and we'll see you next week.